Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in our studios in the Air Force Association's Washington headquarters building. And our guest today is Richard Aboulafia, the Vice President of Analysis at the Teal Group Consultancy, a very old and good friend. Richard, welcome.
Great to be here, Vago. Thanks.
Great to have you. You gave a great talk at the National Aeronautic Association, where you're an annual speaker, and we start every year with Richard's take on the world. And you were talking about the commercial market. You talked about the military market, and I'd like to talk about both of those. But start with commercial. You've always said that this. Your job used to be historically very easy. 7 up cycle, 7 up years, 3 down years. Lather, rinse, repeat is what you used to say. And you're somebody who's driven by the numbers. You spend a lot of time looking at numbers for trends. And you started out this year by talking about how none of these numbers should be encouraging, and yet they're encouraging and you're bullish. So the numbers don't mean anything. So tell us a little bit about your assessment for the commercial aircraft market and why numbers mean nothing anymore.
Yeah, how to reconcile, right? To paraphrase Kellyanne Conway, here are some alternative numbers. The reality is that this year, well, let's sort of back up and look at the big picture. You've got 2 narrow-body jet families constituting about 60% of commercial market output, which of course in turn constitutes about 60% of the entire aviation business. So they really are the big needle movers. And you had a lot of disruptions to the supply chain because of the conversion from the 737NG to the 737 MAX, and even more so for the 320 CEO to the NEO. Right. Because of that disruption, the normal trajectory based on market demand of production has been disrupted by about 1 year. This year ahead, based on fourth quarter numbers, is looking way much better. So it doesn't look like our upward trajectory is being interrupted more than last year's rather thin results. And
one of the other things that you said, you came up with, I always loved the way you come up with sort of interesting analogies, and you had interest rates and fuel price as a ratio. That is a new ratio, right? So talk to us about how fuel prices and interest rates were linked and how they're now delinked and why it's even more relevant than it used to be, or as relevant as it used to be.
Yeah, it's a curiosity of the economics world. I've yet to meet somebody who can explain why they were linked way back for many decades. If anyone's watching this, please let me know.
We're going to put your slides up while you're talking. So
excellent.
If you want to talk to any particular part of your slide deck, we should have given you a clicker.
Well, you can see about a dozen years ago, all of a sudden, these indices became massively delinked to the point where you had almost absurdly cheap cash and almost absurdly expensive fuel. And the complication from an airline fleet planning standpoint was immense. It used to be that if fuel was cheap, chances are cash was too. So you just, you kept your jet because you had no reason to replace it. And if fuel was expensive, well, the chances are so was capital. So, you really couldn't afford to replace it. And you just replaced jets or grew as needed or whatever. And now for the first time, you had every economic incentive in the world to replace your older, thirstier jets and all the cheap cash in the world with which to do it. Now, the one thing that's not seen in this slide is that at the same time there was a complete collapse of all other investment opportunities out there in the world, right. Whether it was the emerging markets, whether it was real estate back in 2008, or whether it was tech stocks, whatever, it all went away. And a lot of financial institutions said, wow, jetliner leasing or financing, that gives you double-digit returns with a globally mobile asset that is repossessible thanks to the Cape Town Convention. We want a part of that. And there was a lot of third-party cash that just came flooding into this business and is still here to stay.
So why is the cycle over? Why are the historic 7 good years, 3 bad years? You joked that you could you would be like, yeah, there's going to be badness coming in 7 years, and then you looked really, really brilliant when you said like, oh yeah, in 3 years, here's 3 years. Why are the cycles over as far as you're concerned?
Why have we escaped the seemingly inevitable course of history, the trajectory that we were on? It seems to be just a very happy convergence. One is the rise of China, which used to be insignificant in this business, 3%, now it's over 20%. Another is that weird bifurcation between capital and fuel that appears to be sticking with us, and it could be based upon long-term structural changes. increasingly global nature of fuel production rather than just concentrated in the OPEC states, the flood of capital looking for a home, particularly in Asia, particularly in China, that appears to be a long-term structural change. And then finally, just more and more people are choosing to spend more of their money on travel. So traffic is showing up as being excellent. Historically, traffic's been a function of GDP. Well, there too, you see a bit of a breakaway with more and more people choosing to spend their cash on travel. So that multiplier is increasing.
So, and what are some of the other, you did mention that, where more people, whether they're in China, you used the great Chinese analogy that, 20 years ago it was, Japanese tourists that you'd see everywhere, as Japan was, after the war, folks had more disposable income. They were investing. They were traveling more. That was a commercial aircraft driver. And then we've seen the same thing happening in China now, where wherever in the world you go, you see a large number of, middle-class Chinese tourists that are out there doing it. What are some of the other major market drivers out there for the commercial business?
Well, there's a lot of untapped potential for other markets, certainly. Latin America, Brazil's recovering from its downturn. India making slow progress towards, creating a sustainable aviation industry that's profitable and has the necessary infrastructure. Those are certainly very big challenges. More of a slow burn thing. The point is, though, that a lot of emerging markets really do appear to be trying to follow China in its path to create sort of a sustainable middle-class consumer business or consumer demographic. And if they do, then the numbers just keep going.
Let's look at, let's talk about Airbus. It's the A320neo, which you mentioned at the very top of this, is sort of like the market dominator right now. Fastest selling jet ever. Largest backlog now. I think it's at 1,500 jets, which is what their backlog is. Absolutely crushing what the MAX is. Even though it's a very, very successful product line. The latest sort of iteration of the 737 line, which is the not quite DC-10, but certainly when it comes to jets, the most produced jet at this point. Talk to us a little bit about how, what the continued prospects for that jet are, but then also what Boeing's response is going to be, because the guys in Seattle are spending a lot of time and a lot of effort to come up with that new middle-of-the-market aircraft, something that is going to take on, they claim it can be game-changing. They claim it can be twin-aisle and doesn't necessarily have to be single-aisle, which we've got some strong thoughts on. I was talking to somebody in Seattle yesterday after your talk about that, a mutual friend. Talk to us a little bit about, how much more legs does the 321 have, and then what does the Boeing answer to this airplane have to be, given that the 321 has just been a runaway success?
Yeah, the 321neo really does appear to be not just a great product in and of itself, but one that could potentially be improved with a new wing, new motors, any number of things. They appear to really have the sweet spot in terms of attacking the 200 to 220 seat market right there. Can't rule out a 322neo, perhaps even a further stretch. As you say, 1,500 right now on backlog. I expect they're going to they're just going to keep that going and keep going. The 737 MAX 10, of course, launched this last year as an effort to get some of that. It appears to have gotten only an incrementally greater number of orders than the MAX 9. Some of them were conversions from MAX 9 to MAX 10. Hence 797, NMA, MOM, whatever you want to call it. A typical Boeing product in that it's going to do well no matter what. They don't get it wrong at Boeing. But is it going to tap into that giant market that the 321neo has tapped into, or is it going to be more of a twin-aisle market, which has completely different economics? They'll be able to take advantage of transatlantic route fragmentation, Middle East, Europe, and Asia route fragmentation. Good machine for that, but not the kind of numbers we're talking about with the 321neo. I think there really is this sort of line between single-aisle economics, both production and operating economics, and twin-aisle economics. And it's not really clear that they can make a plane good enough to bridge that divide.
How do you see, both of these giants have been, every time, it is very much a duopoly, and anytime anybody looks like they're going to try to challenge that duopoly, they're now co-opted or bought out, right? So we saw Bombardier get very, very close with the C-Series, which is a great airplane. The U.S. brought its trade action against Bombardier. Then Bombardier made the deal with Airbus. Now there's talk, and right away everybody began speculating right away that Boeing would do something with Embraer. And now it looks like, obviously there are talks between those two companies that are ongoing. They were partnered on the KC-390 program. Talk to us sort of more broadly about what both of these plays by these giants mean for the market, the future, how they're positioning themselves, and then what it means for the smaller companies, right? I mean, do they get out of certain product lines? I mean, you're not a fan of, you know, regional aircraft and turboprops as such, for example, and I think you view regional aircraft as a dirty word. Talk to us a little bit about how the absorption or a partnership between Boeing and Embraer, and then Airbus and Bombardier, and how that potentially changes the market or not.
I think it really does cement the duopoly, assuming it gets consummated with you know, Bombardier and Airbus on one side, and Boeing and Embraer either doing a JV, an alliance, or an outright acquisition on the other. It really does create this sort of impenetrable fortress, if you will, of existing producers, of legacy producers. It would be tough to find your way in, given the enormous pricing power, distribution portals, and supply chain arrangements that they're going to have at these two giant megaliths. It's only going to further create barriers to entry. You know, of course, it leaves the question of Russia. Can they get back to anything like what they were? And that's going to take an awful lot of work and a lot of uncertainty. In China, which has none of the intellectual property, but a fair amount of money, and of course the biggest market in the world as they move forward. The most intriguing possibility is a sort of closed system where Russia and China cooperate. I don't think that would be a happy outcome for the simple reason that I believe in a global solution rather than one that's based on protectionism. And it's far from certain that the Chinese will agree to protect their market to keep out anybody who'd normally be imported. But you can't rule it out as a scenario. But until they make that decision, then China is up for grabs, and Airbus and Boeing are going to do very well in that market. And that'll further cement their duopoly.
COMAC has been trying to get on the map. Obviously not looking at, you know, sort of like, you know, industrial age, slab-sided, steam-powered airplanes that, you know, sort of was the perception that what a state-owned company is going to produce. But, you know, you've always been skeptical about projects like this, especially sort of nationally spearheaded prestige projects like the 919. And you said that thankfully China is doing every single thing wrong on that program to make sure that it doesn't succeed. Talk to us about the mistakes that they're making. And if you know anything about the Chinese, they will make those mistakes on the 919, which they will absolutely be sure not to repeat on the next airplane they build. So what are the mistakes they're making on 919? They're going to hamper it. And ultimately, do you think that COMAC succeeds and becomes the third guy, you know, that it's no longer a duopoly?
Yeah, that's certainly the biggest wild card. I mean, you look at the history of this business, though, and it tells us an interesting story. There's only been one newcomer in 100 years, and that's Embraer. 1969 is when they were created. And the first thing they did was they said to their engineers, look, we are creating a national champion here, but go shopping, get the best at the best price, go elsewhere in the world for all the guts. I think it was Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, who said, yes, Embraer is a huge Brazilian exporter. It's also one of their hugest importers. That's the way you have to play it. The Chinese are doing the exact opposite of that. They're saying, we're going to do the whole thing in country. We're going to learn from our partners. You bring your technology to us, and we incorporate it into our plane, and then we take that intellectual property. It is ours. So you've got a lot of people showing up with the latest and best from 30 years ago, because that is exactly what they must do. Their board would have a word with them, but they said, you gave your latest and best to people who told you they were going to take that technology. And as a result, you had the ARJ-21, which was China's first jet, and something now that, like you know, a Politburo member from back in the 30s, airbrushed out of company photos and brochures, no one wants to talk about it. C919 has the same sort of original sin, if you will, of, you know, mandatory vertical integration coupled with, you know, absolutely no IP protection. Now, the only silver lining in all of this is if they just flip a switch and be like Embraer, I think the Western world would be terrified, because these guys, they've got all the talent, they've got the greatest market, and they've got a lot of resources. They'd be great.
I have that book, The Commissar Vanishes, where you look at the pictures of, you know, like large number of people around Stalin, and eventually it's sort of like two people on either side, like, you know, a large gap of all the people. That's actually very not funny, considering that, you know, those people didn't go to a retirement village somewhere. No. Let's, speaking about retirement, the A380 was looking like it was heading toward retirement, at least until they finish the number of jets that they had on backlog. All eyes, you know, we were in Dubai, all eyes were on the whole drama about whether the Emirates were going to come through. There's a protracted bout of negotiating, and then Emmanuel Macron goes to China, and then there's the offer that the Chinese get into the A380, and the Chinese didn't bite on that. And then eventually, lo and behold, last week we had that big announcement that Emirates is coming in with up to as many as 36 aircraft, and Airbus says that that's going to stretch production out for 10 years. And you think that that is actually the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. So tell us why it's so bad that deal has actually gone through.
Well, it's pretty clear, judging by what Emirates said back at the Dubai Air Show, as you say, when there was the chance of a simple direct order, what they wanted a production line guarantee for 10 years.
Which Tom Enders didn't want to give them.
Which Tom Enders did not want to give them. Well, it appears to be the case that in exchange for a letter of intent to buy 20 and possibly 16 more, they have gotten exactly that. In other words, Airbus folded. They're not even getting what they were hoping for at Dubai, and they gave them a 10-year production guarantee. So you've got all of these cathedrals of overhead, if you will, the massive cost you associate with building.
The Chartres of overhead.
The Chartres of overhead, yeah, very much, with the flying buttresses, and all for maybe 20 firm planes. So if you could imagine, the real cost of these planes will be approximately 5 times what they're selling them for, unless other airlines come through. And other airlines do not look, I mean, by definition, if they were going to come through, they would have come through by now. So it's quite possible that John Leahy, for all his many virtues and skills as a salesperson, has just left a gift that will keep on giving for 10 years.
The fact that nobody's bought it yet, we have seen time and again when somebody comes out and says, all right, I want this jet, and it prolongs it long enough to give it enough legs that another person comes on and jumps onto it. You know, whether it's the Singaporeans in the F-15, then you have the Saudis come back around and say, okay, we'll do that again. Talk to us, you know, who might be interested in an airplane of that size? You know, could there be a freighter derivative? I don't think so, right? It doesn't have the opening nose, for example, that the 747 series has, right? That allows much more easily to put cargo on and off. Could be a package airplane. You know, who might be interested in a jet?
I am having a really hard time thinking of anybody other than Emirates. From the cargo standpoint, the real killer is the double-deck floor. That floor in the middle just completely breaks up what you want to do with it. For parcel freight, oh my God, parcel freight's all about frequency, fragmentation, everything like that. The one, you know, talk about a mega hub, you know, recreating Louisville somewhere in the middle of, you know, I mean, no, bad idea, I think. And other than that, you know, I mean, this plane is very much just perfect for the market environment of 1995, where everybody wants to change planes or must change planes at Narita, Heathrow, or Frankfurt. If you have a world of more and more city pairs where, well, you and I are Washington residents, we can finally fly direct to Spain, thank God. It took us how many years to get to Spain without having to go through Charles de Gaulle or something? And now we can. And as the system grows, more and more of these city pairs are going to be possible. And they're going to consign a 4-engine, 500-seater to the dustbin of history.
And just so that anybody knows, it's a wonder that he's actually not a Spanish citizen, given how much time he likes to spend in Spain. We digress. Let me ask you, let's go to the military market. The conventional wisdom has been that the military market, you know, that the F-35 was a little bit too rich for everybody's blood. That, you know, between, you know, 100 something and, you know, or even if we get to the magic 80 million or even less, Chris Bogdan and Matt Winter have talked about getting below that $80 million threshold. And so everybody was like, look, nobody's going to spend that much money on the export market. And Saab has invested in a new jet, the Super Gripen, in order to try to capitalize on that. You have the French who are getting more legs with the Dassault guys with the Rafale. And even the Eurofighter guys think, hey, we might be able to eke another couple of sales out of there. But you're saying basically that the market is actually going to the F-35. Talk about the market dynamics, what's happening, and what does it mean for everybody else in this business that's been investing and hoping to get a piece of the action, even so much so, you know, full disclosure, you know, Leonardo and DRS are our sponsors, you know, in terms of the weaponization, for example, of the 346 and some of the smaller lines of aircraft that, you know, the Leonardo guys have thought, hey, you know, we might be able to get some sales, you know, especially, you know, with nations that don't want to spend as much money on an airplane. Scorpion, you know, that's one of the things that's driving it. Talk to us a little bit about, you know, that fundamental market shift.
Well, I think it's accompanied by a broader reality, which is that the coming death of the manned tactical fighter has been greatly exaggerated. I mean, you actually look at the broader market, the top line is growing very nicely. Matter of fact, if just looking at the stuff that's been signed in the pipeline, you're looking at a market that's growing by 50% over the next 10 years. Phenomenal numbers. In that context, there's a lot of room, both for the legacy players you just mentioned, for, yes, absolutely, armed derivatives of smaller jets, and perhaps most of all, certainly most of all, F-35. Everything is growing. Now, in the context of that growth, what amazes me and proves me quite wrong over my 20 years of worrying about this, that people wouldn't step up to the plate and pay $100 million for a jet fighter. Historically, that was just a market of 3, 4, 5. That market was growing very slowly. There'd be indigenous people who'd buy their own $100 million jets, you know, Europe and the Tornado and Eurofighter. But the idea of export players like Norway saying, yeah, 100 million, okay, sure.
Netherlands also.
Netherlands.
Right? I mean, we thought this would be something that would be for U.S., U.K., Japan,
right.
maybe Singapore.
Right. Saudi when they're allowed, you know, that sort of thing. Exactly. And this appears to be a far more broader phenomenon. People are simply saying, yeah, we know we get smaller, but we want that combat effectiveness. So the broader top line is growing. Pretty much everyone's prospering. To be honest, the only way you can really do bad is if you look at your number one customer and say, it's Canada, they're going to buy the Super Hornet, so let's sue them. That's about the only thing you can do to not prosper in this growth market.
I want to get to trade actions in a second, but I want to exhaust the military question first. So talk to us a little bit about the U.S. military market. You know, we're going to see more money going in. Aircraft modernization is a major priority. If you look at, you know, the Air Force has made clear what its top 3 are. Remarkable focus on, you know, the B-21, the F-35, and the KC-46. You know, we've talked a little bit about the 35, but talk to us a little bit about the B-21. What you see on the KC-46, which is something that, you know, continues to cost Boeing quite a lot of money as they continue on the development of that, and not clear whether we're through the woods on that. Give us sort of a survey of the U.S., but also a little bit of a flavor of the global market.
Yeah, I mean, the market for enablers is also pretty darn strong. You know, it was only a couple of years ago that you could say that no one had ever actually purchased a new build tanker. It was almost always surplus KC-135s or, you know, converted Airbus A310s or whatever. But now people are signing for them, whether they're KC-30s or KC-46s. That's a growth market, absolutely. And of course, the long-awaited KC-135 replacement market is finally kicking in a couple of decades late. I will provide a cautious defense of Boeing here. You know, yes, it's going to cost them another write-off, almost certainly. Probably another delay is still in negotiation, but it's worth it. You know, I mean, because the idea that they're going to disrupt KCX and move over to KCY, disrupt the KC-135 recapitalization processes, that's not going to happen. They're probably going to keep going with KC-46s beyond the 179 program of record aircraft, which means that whatever they're paying, ultimately $3 billion in overruns, whatever it will be, well worth it. They protected the market and got to sell hundreds of jets. Smart move. As for the B-21, aside from the tactical concerns of the continuing resolution and whatever else might disrupt the funding process, that also looks like it's here to stay. The strategic requirement for a power projector like that, given what's going on in Asia, is very strong. The aging fleet, of course, also. Very broad bipartisan political support for this plane. I think Northrop Grumman will get it right. Certainly the initial reports indicate that. And I think the number that's commonly used is, you know, 100 being a pretty good baseline. Beyond, you know, the 75, another 25 beyond that, I think is probably a pretty good assumption.
There is a large debate going on now on future of joint stars and special mission aircraft. Mike Holmes, Mobile Holmes, the chief of Air Combat Command, has sort of said, well, you know, maybe let's take a pause. We may need potentially a different answer to this. He's also a proponent of sort of a bifurcated fleet of less expensive, much more simple counterinsurgency aircraft, given that we've been burning through fast jets for a mission that could be accomplished by other folks. But you're a little bit skeptical about that model. Why are you skeptical?
Well, first of all, looking as a friend of the Air Force.
In the AFA building.
In the AFA building, here we are. I have family Air Force connections, and I deeply respect the institution. I'm wondering what they're thinking.
Are you at all concerned that there's going to be like some general officers like General Goldfein or anybody else with a 2x4 with a nail in it waiting for you in a hallway?
Watching for shadows, but I am mindful. I mean, we all love the Air Force and support them, but I'm just concerned about the optics here. I mean, the one consistent thing that's been thrown at the Air Force is that they've got this focus upon the high altitude, clear the air stuff rather than support the ground pounders. And here they are thinking about, well, neglecting, to use a strong word, probably one of the best ways they can support the ground pounders with something that obviously tracks targets. I'm a little concerned about that. But more importantly, I think the revolution in architecture, dispersed assets that can do this mission, that's going to be longer away than we think. It's going to happen, absolutely. That combination, that constellation of satellites with UAVs and dispersed, obviously combat aircraft radars that are networked into everybody else's system. It's going to happen. Is it after those E-8s start aging out? Yeah, almost certainly. So just from the standpoint of optics and practicality, I think this is probably something they're going to want to resume work on.
Let me take you to trade actions. You are a free trader. As we speak, the World Economic Forum is convening in a very, very snowy Davos that has experienced some logistical challenges. Great, even though there's climate change, like this year, it's got to be sort of record, a 20-year snowfall. But talk to us a little bit about some of your. Are you concerned? We've now seen the president take action on Bombardier, which was something that Boeing wanted very, very much and pushed the administration to do, and the administration accepted that. We saw Whirlpool press very aggressively, and so there's a washing machine tariffs imposed on South Korean washing machines in particular. We've seen it on solar panels, even though those solar panels go into stuff that folks in the United States do, and it creates tens of thousands of jobs in the United States.
Absolutely.
So, are you concerned that there could be a brewing trade war? Talk to us about the concerns with NAFTA in the event that NAFTA breaks down and what that means for the commercial aerospace business, given how critical suppliers exist on both sides of the border. There are key manufacturers in Mexico that are producing grade A, top shelf global aerospace components, just like Canada has an invisible border with the United States and has had since before World War II. Talk to us. Are you concerned, and what are the potential implications for trade conflicts like this that can spiral very, very rapidly out of control? It could start with washing machines, but it ends up someplace we just did not expect.
Yeah, I mean, this is the one thing that keeps me up at night, absolutely, not just for our industry, but I think for our society. Let's back up by going back a year ago. Whatever political stripes you wear, if you're in this industry and you saw what this administration originally promised from a trade perspective, you are obligated to be absolutely, completely out of your mind with fear, because frankly, all of it would have been toxic. You talk about one of the biggest drivers behind the commercial jetliner growth cycle, and indeed every aspect of aerospace, globalization is certainly at the center of it, whether it's the globalization of finance, the supply chain, or sales portals. All three are hugely dependent upon globalization, therefore the market is too. You look at the administration coming in, 45% tariffs on Chinese imports. There's no way that does not devastate the single biggest export market for jetliners. The border adjustment tax, how does this not guarantee retaliation? Every single thing that was promised, the end to WTO of mechanisms, all of these things make enormous sense as long as you assume that the rest of the world lies horizontally quiet and doesn't retaliate, which of course is what we know from history as what is not going to happen. They do retaliate, things get ugly. Now, for some reason, amazingly, we dodged every single bullet last year, every single trade initiative. And Steve Bannon, as they say, has left the building. As an industry, I think we can say we dodged that bullet, good. But as you say, there's all these new things coming on. whether it's Whirlpool or solar panels, and you never know when this threat is going to spiral into something far more dangerous. And if you attack them with solar panels, yes, they might retaliate against you with a combat aircraft order that goes to the other guy, or a jetliner order, or any number of other possibilities. And meanwhile, when you attack trade in commercial jets with trade complaints against perceived subsidies in other countries, you're also creating precedents that could damage that global regime in world trade or in world finance. One of the great principles behind jetliner finance that has been such a key enabler in the growth of the market has been the idea that an asset in one country is worth the same as an asset in another country. But all of a sudden you're saying, no, there'll be a tariff upon the asset, and that could really send a chill because the financiers are going to say, gee, that could happen elsewhere if people retaliate. Nothing good can come of these sorts of trade complaints.
Do you think that NAFTA is going to be equitably negotiated? Or do you see the United States or one of the parties walking away? There are still some very, very hard issues. The U.S. has put its demands out. Canadians have sort of said that some of those they disagree with very, very strongly. What are the implications for the U.S. defense and aerospace ecosystem if NAFTA crumbles?
Well, not as absolutely terrifying as some of the other initiatives. I mean, no one wants to see NAFTA go away in this industry. Certainly, it's been a key enabler in creating a global market, or especially a supply chain that serves a global market based in North America. But if you look at the impact of tariffs reverting back to sort of a WTO level, it's not that terrible. It's not that absolutely terrifying. 45% tariff against Chinese imports, that's terrifying. And in NAFTA, with renegotiation of tariff levels back to something before, it's burdensome, but not catastrophic. As a matter of fact, the variations in foreign exchange could either make could basically greatly outweigh those changes in a couple of weeks or months. And there's some evidence that there would be some variation in FX on the basis of this anyway. So something to worry about, something I wouldn't want to tamper with, but if it does, it's probably not an existential threat, as they say.
What are going to be the three most interesting aerospace stories this year?
Yeah, definitely 797, absolutely. Boeing middle market jet, probably announced sometime around Farnborough. That's good. They've promised a number of interesting technologies on that plane. Could have the highest percentage yet of composite structures. Definitely what's going on between Airbus and Bombardier, and you could roll that into the trade deal too. So we'll find out on Friday at about 2:30 what the ITC's ruling is. It could be this whole thing vanishes like a very bad dream, or it could be that things get worse, and no one wants that.
And we'll do a podcast with you right after that decision is made so that people can get your take on it.
Looking forward to it. The third, I would argue, is just the ramp across the board. You look at the real needle movers in this business. The top 5 programs in aviation are about 50% of the total industry. And 3 of the 5 are on a ramp: 737 MAX, A320 Neo, including your friend the 321 Neo, just a great plane, and the F-35. All of them have an awful lot of momentum behind them in terms of demand, and if they can show the kind of high single-digit, low double-digit improvements in output this year, you've got a really good year ahead.
Which is what you've forecast. And I apologize, I did sort of screw up a little bit. I should have said the A320 line. I got focused on the A321 in part because it's been such a game changer in its segment. Let me just step back. One little clarification on 797 from you. Do you think that Boeing can pull it off? Because the Boeing contention is we intend to game change with this aircraft. And after your talk and you're sort of concerned that nobody's ever done a twin-aisle airplane, for example, that has the kind of economics that a single-aisle airplane has for that mission. A friend of mine at Boeing said, listen, when you see what it is we're going to do, it's really going to change the economics of the whole business. It's not going to be something as simple as re-engineering or re-winging. This is going to be a dramatic redefinition. Do you think Boeing is going to be able to pull that off, especially if they may be leaning towards something that's twin-aisle?
I'm intrigued by it. I mean, certainly all this talk and Boeing's great track record at product execution in the commercial jetliner business, particularly with wide bodies. I'm really intrigued. My fear is that they are focused on getting people who really need the outer end of that range payload capability, people who really need something 4,500 to 5,000 nautical miles, who really need 250 seats. In other words, just a notch out of reach of a 321neo or any kind of growth version, in which case that's a good market. It's a nice niche. Game changer, probably too strong a word. What I'd like to see is how it would do in the core of the 321neo market, say 3,000 nautical miles, 2,500 nautical miles, transcon US, just 200 seats or 210, something like that. That's going to be a tough sell to create technology that really impinges upon that core A321neo market.
Where does the C Series fit in Airbus's line?
Well, they've kind of agreed to make room for it. It's kind of funny. No sooner did they make that deal, than John Leahy, I believe, came out.
Because it's an unusual size for where, the sort of the medium market for Airbus is.
Yeah, it's right where the CS300, obviously the C Series 2 planes, CS100, more of an Embraer competitor, CS300, 319neo, pretty much head to head. And no sooner did they do that deal when Airbus said, we're going to put the A319neo on the back burner and give this thing prominence. Now, the real question will be when they look at the technology of the CS300, do they decide to do a growth version, the long-awaited CS500, and perhaps make the A320neo go away in time and use this? And on top of that, when they look at what they've got at Belfast has a very interesting composite technology, resin transfer infusion, resin transfer molded. It's the basis for the C Series wing. Could it be adapted to the rest of the Airbus product line, the narrow-body product line? That'll be really intriguing. Debate is still underway about whether that's a great technology or whether it's just another form of black aluminum or what have you. We're going to have to wait and see, but there's certainly a lot of potential. In other words, even though there's a modest degree of overlap at most in the current C Series Airbus narrow-body product line, the potential for sort of cross-fertilization technologically is definitely there. I would argue that you've got this new generation of engines obviously emerging for the two biggest single aircraft programs by a wide margin, A320neo and 737 MAX. You've got the LEAP one from CFM and the Pratt & Whitney GTF. This is when the rubber hits the tarmac and, well, the turbofan really sucks in the air, whatever metaphor you like.
Sucks in the chicken?
It sucks in the chicken. What's sort of fascinating is that you've always had competitions between engine people before using very similar architectures. It's like, well, ours is French vanilla, and here you've got two completely different approaches to engine design, one using a planetary gearbox, the other using advanced materials and higher temperatures, but yet promising basically the same results. We're going to find out a lot this year. It sort of reminds me of the Dire Straits line, two men say they're Jesus, one of them must be wrong. We're going to find out.
And we're not trying to put religious overtones on any engine choice. Richard, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Same here. Thanks.